"Come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker." The psalmist makes it sound so straightforward in Psalm 95:6. And yet if you read a few books on worship, it becomes clear that there are enormous areas of disagreement between sincere Christians about precisely how we should worship God. To take just a couple of examples, what may we sing in our worship services? Should we sing only metrical psalms, as is the custom of the Reformed Presbyterian Church in North America? Should we sing the Psalms plus a limited number of traditional, denominationally approved hymns, as is the pattern in some continental Reformed traditions? Or are we permitted to sing anything at all, limited only by theological correctness and good taste? And in what position should we pray? Standing up, kneeling down, or sitting? It's plain that there is widespread diversity in our beliefs and our practices of worship. And the key question in the midst of that diversity becomes, how do we know how we should worship? For some churches, the key element is history. And that may be the reconstructed simplicity of the early church, or the complexity of the historic liturgy of Eastern Orthodoxy, or simply the traditions of a particular church. We've always done it this way. Other churches, meanwhile, are driven not so much by history as they are by sociology. They're designed to be attractive to outsiders. So that becomes the key element in determining what things to include and what things to leave out. Now, these twin criteria of sociology and history are not bad in themselves. We should be powerfully aware of anything in our worship services which makes it uncomfortable for non-Christians to be there. For instance, if you're going to say the Apostles' Creed in your worship service, I think you should probably print it in your bulletin so that an unchurched visitor can follow along. We should think deeply about how to make our churches more seeker-friendly, whether by translating into plain language the churchy jargon that we so easily slip into, or simply making sure that it's easy to find their way around our church building. What's more, we should know the history of the church and learn from the best of the past. One of the areas where I think the gospel challenges contemporary American culture is in its historical disconnectedness. We live in the now generation, but we're called to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Church history provides us with the biblical exegesis of past generations of Christians, expressed in their worship practices. Now, we may sometimes disagree with that exegesis, but we should certainly be familiar with the questions that they asked and the reasons why they chose to do the things that they did. Indeed, despite their radical cry of sola scriptura, the Reformers did not insist on creating worship services from scratch, but regularly built on the example of the early church. They didn't regard the early church as an infallible guide, but they frequently found it a helpful source of enlightenment. And we would do well to treat the worship services of the Reformation era in the same way. These theologians thought deeply and biblically about the subject of worship. They may not always have been right in their conclusions, but they were always thoroughly helpful in posing questions and in clarifying issues. But even though history, sociology, these things are good, none of them is to be our touchstone in worship. Rather, it's vital that the Scriptures and the Scriptures alone regulate our worship. Our pattern of worship is not to be the early church or the Reformation church or the needs of the contemporary situation or how we feel about things, but the Bible alone. And the historic affirmation of that belief is called the regulative principle of worship. That is, the idea that in all of our worship we are always and only to do as God has commanded us in His Word.